every Christian was a Jew. We had not left the Jewish tradition. Jesus was obviously a Jew. I shouldn't say obviously, because some people don't know that. Jesus was a Jew, and he remained a Jew, and he never changed from being a Jew. And the early folks that believed in what Jesus was talking about were Jewish. And it was just another sect of Judaism at the time. And in the first century, Judaism was all about different sects. There were the Pharisees. Those are the ones that we hear about all the time in the Bible stories. The Pharisees had a belief in the resurrection. It was a very popular movement within Judaism, and they were very concerned about the law, following the law and making sure that you followed the law. The law being the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay? Then there was a group called the Essenes. The Essenes were a Jewish withdrawal group. They were apocalyptic. They were very concerned about end times. Where have we heard this story before? Very much like some Christian sects today, and we'll talk about that. There was another group called the Sadducees, and that was the temple aristocracy group, the group that worked in the temple and made sure that everything was done correctly. We hear about the Sadducees in the story when Jesus is being killed, and the aristocracy are asked the questions at the time. There's another group called the Zealots, and they were the guerrillas of the Jewish movement. They were the political insurrectionists who were out there trying to change the church and the world through political activities. And then there were these Christians, known early as the new little cult, and very much a part of the Jewish tradition. They don't start getting pushed in Judaism, like I said, until around 100 CE, probably in the 90s sometime. And you can start to feel that pressure of them being pushed when you read the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is the last gospel that was written, probably not written until 90 or 95 or so. And you feel that pressure in that book because John keeps saying things like, the Jews did this, and the Jews did that. Well, nobody talked like that. They were all Jews. And that's where some of our anti-Semitism comes from today. These phrases in John about the Jews persecuting them. But that's all about this battle that's going on in the synagogue for what's going on. So we'll go back to that at some point. But I just want you to get that Christianity is just one of these sects within Judaism and is growing along with everything else. Okay? Now, of course, this is all happening in Roman society, and I want to compare and contrast those because I think that's really important. So Roman society at the time in the first century is very stratified, meaning, well, it's stratified. It looks like this. My church history professor at CDSP, Rebecca Lyman, who I respect more than any historian that I have ever worked with. Read Rebecca Lyman's stuff; she's just amazing. But we always joked around with Rebecca because in the first 6 weeks of church history class, she drew a triangle on the board and then used it for something. So I want to give Rebecca credit for this. So Roman society was very stratified. You had at the bottom you had rural workers. I hope to find one of these that actually works.
It's working.
It's working. And then in the next group, artisans. And then knights. And then the urban minority. And the top of the pyramid was 0.002% of the population. The urban minority was 1/10 of 1% of the population. Okay. So if that's starting to sound familiar, you're hearing a lot of talk about this happening in American society right now.
What is an urban minority?
So, what's that?
What is the meaning of urban minority? What is it? Can you give me an example of someone that would be fall that
Yes.
category?
So they would be people that would work in the governmental system, political people.
Civil servants?
Civil servants. Yeah. So you see, everything kind of just rose to the top. Okay. It's also a very conservative society, meaning that there's a concern for status, and it's also a very vertical society, as you can see. So it's also very polytheistic, of course, religion-wise, and the basic Roman approach was the more gods, the better. And they just brought in everybody else's gods into their pantheon of gods. And so they had no problem with bringing Judaism and or Christianity into the system. It was we that had the problem, saying, you don't understand. We're suggesting there's only one God. But they were fine with bringing in the Jewish God. The conflict was from our standpoint. Okay? So Christians see Romans in this world as material-oriented and worried about this life only. And Romans see Christians basically as just weird. They saw them as kind of little children who, and they were just tolerant of them. Like I said, they're certainly willing to bring Christ into the pantheon of gods. It was just us that had the problem with that. So Christians were persecuted sporadically in the early church, and it was very sporadic. It's not like you see in the movies where all the time. It didn't happen like that at all. And the first real persecution was around the year 95 CE. And this is when martyrdom starts to become a goal within Christianity. When people started getting killed for their faith, they were held up and honored, and martyrdom actually started to become an ultimate goal within the church. By 100 CE, the Christian movement is very urban and inclusive, meaning that we take everybody in. So it's also not like you see in the movies that it's this country movement. It wasn't like that at all. Most of Christianity was building in urban societies, not in the country. So that's very different than what you see. So it's an inclusive faith by it's an inclusive faith, meaning that it takes everybody in, but it's exclusive by belief. So they're saying to Roman folks, no, you can't be a part of this unless you're going to say that this is the only God. So that's what's going on. By 100 CE, Christianity was in 40 to 50 cities. Churches were held in houses, small house churches. There were, to give you some idea of numbers, there were about 50,000 Christians in the empire of 60 million people, okay, at around 100. To give you some idea of scale there. So that's why it was called a new little cult. But these people had this amazing confidence that they were accomplishing what they were setting out to do, that they had this ideal that they had learned from Jesus, and they really felt like they were living into what Jesus taught them. And it gave them this confidence that's hard to even understand today. They felt empowered and emboldened, even though they were such a small group in this society. Within these groups, there was a lot of discussion about authority within Christianity. And at the time, The names of some of those leaders in the church were apostles and prophets and teachers and deacons and elders, what later became presbyters. And then, after all of that, bishops. The first bishops that we know of in the church were around 110 is the first reference we can find to any bishop in the church. But bishops were a lot different then than they are now. It was still basically a charismatic movement, so they weren't seen as people making decisions, but just leaders of a charismatic movement. So basically authority and leadership in the early church was very spirit driven and very charismatic. There was a lot of people gathering, listening to God, and saying, we're living into this, and isn't this cool?
Amen.
Yep. So
Amen.
that's what it was. So it was a very charismatic movement. So the church is an egalitarian organization in this world that's very stratified. So you see there's an immediate clash with the culture. For example, the early church is including poor people in this organization, and women, and of course women had no place in the society, zero. And there's this church saying that women can be leaders and can run churches, and we have proof in the early church that women were leading the church, and we read about that in Paul's early writings, and I will give you some of that to look at in leisure. So this is two-sided, but on one side it says women in early Christian mission, and we'll talk about the other side later. But there's some proof of that. Years ago there was this book that came out called When Women Were Priests. I can't even remember the author of that book. I can't remember. I'm going to encourage you to not look at that book from a historical perspective, because there's not a lot of good scholarship in that book, and we don't know that women were ever priests. I would love to tell you that they were, but we don't know that. What we do know is that there were women running house churches, but they weren't called priests. Okay? So there's a lot of pressure in the society when women and folks are being in there. The other major thing that's going on then is that those bishops are being elected by the people in the early church. So there's this democratic movement within the church, which is also very different from the Roman society. So there is this external pressure from a culture that isn't egalitarian or inclusive, and this internal pressure starts building as disagreements start to build about who we are. And the first real discussion around who we are, and you've got the spirit-driven movement, and everybody's thinking different ways and saying different things, and the church says, well we got to figure out some way to control this.
Steve?
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but did these women who ran churches
Yep.
in the homes,
Yep.
were their titles like reverend? No, not reverend, but just
Not
name.
that we can find.
Just name.
The list I gave you earlier, apostles, elders, prophets,
Okay.
teachers,
Okay.
they were called those things, but that's all we have evidence of. And on that sheet of paper, it's just the Christian Testament evidence. Okay? And folks that fit in there. Okay? So the first real issue was Gnosticism. And my guess is that all of you have heard of Gnosticism, and Gnosticism is a very big thing, and we don't have time to get into all of the details of Gnosticism, but so I'm just going to give you a general description here. Gnosticism was an explanation as to why life sucks. To put it in technical terms, it means secret knowledge. Okay, and it was very attractive to many Christians because Christians were sometimes being persecuted, and there's a lot of poor people. So it's an interesting idea for a lot of folks. Excuse me. It's a very world-negating philosophy. It separates the world into a spiritual world and a material world. And it says that the spiritual part is good and the material stuff is bad. You see where that's going to take us here a little bit. It's a very dualistic way of thinking, and it really does just split those two things. Material bad, spiritual good. So Gnosticism kind of forces the early church fathers, and they were fathers by this time, to define orthodoxy. They define what it meant to be a Christian. And this is when we start moving away a little bit from charism and spirit-driven stuff, because somebody's going to say, okay, this is okay to believe, and this is not okay to believe. And Gnosticism is rejected by those folks for a couple reasons. And their main arguments are, no, the material world is good. Read Genesis. What did God say when God made the world? That it's good. And so that's what they pointed to. And they also said there is no secret knowledge, that everything is revealed in the scriptures, and we don't need anything more than that. But Gnosticism stuck, even though in many ways, even though the church said, no, this is not an orthodox belief, it really stuck. And the idea of asceticism and the fact that you wanted to separate yourself from the material world and just be in the spiritual place really stuck with us. So even though Gnosticism left, that became a major part of what Christianity was all about. And we're going to soon get to Augustine of Hippo, and we're going to talk about that material stuff and how we poo-pooed that, and how sex started to become a bad thing in the church, and all that fun stuff. But I'm jumping ahead, okay? I'm also going to suggest to you that Gnosticism always comes back. In some form or another, we deal with it again today in multiple forms. People always want to split things up and say this is good and this is bad, and this is black and this is white. And that's not how Christianity worked. And it's certainly not how Anglicanism works. But now I'm jumping way classes ahead, so forget that. So orthodoxy becomes creation was good and had a purpose. And this is the beginning of bishops having an authoritarian role in the church. Because they've said, okay, Gnosticism isn't good. And it's the beginning of the bishops making decisions like this for us. So bishops start to take on this authoritarian role. And that it doesn't take very long before people are looking to the bishops to give them that information and telling them what is saving truth and what isn't. So we're up to the early 200s now. And so in 100 years, you see that we've already made a major shift from the early church. This egalitarian movement that's spirit-driven has now has leaders who are making decisions about what's orthodox and what isn't. Okay? So in those early 200s, there are a lot of conversations about Christology, meaning what do we do with Jesus? So here we are, a monotheistic church. We believe in one God, and Christianity is holding up Jesus as God or part of God, or we don't know what to do with that. And that becomes the main conversation in the early church. And there's a lot of discussions about how we handle this, how we stay a monotheistic church but believe in Jesus. And in those early days, there are a couple different ideas that come across. One of them is adoptionism. And the other is asceticism. So adoptionists said that Jesus was a human being. He was nothing but a human being, but he was infused with this divine spirit. Okay? And the ascetics said that, that Jesus was divine, that he was really totally divine, and he was just masked in flesh. It was a divine being that had flesh around him, that he only seems to be human, and that God doesn't suffer, so Jesus didn't suffer. So this went back and forth for many, many years as people tried to figure out how to explain Jesus in a monotheistic world. And the ending winner is this theology called Logos theology, which comes out of Greek thought. We would call it enfleshed incarnation. That Jesus is a human being, but is enfleshed in this way, kind of the way the Greeks talked about Logos thinking. And Origen, this guy named Origen, describes the Logos as the mediator between God and humans, and that this person is stuck with a material body. Another guy named Justin said that Christ is the mediator between human and divinity, and is a step below God and above humans. So in between there. So these are all these ways to try to figure out all this. Nothing got settled. Okay? Everybody had a different opinion about this, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it. That becomes a major thing in the church, and that will go on for another 100 years. Okay? All right. Let's move to North Africa very quickly. In North Africa, there is a persecution going on, so we're talking about in the 200s now. It was called the Diocletian persecution. And a lot of people recant their faith during this time. And there's a big discussion in the church about whether we should let these people back in after the persecution's over. The people that recanted their faith, should we let them back in? And if we do, what do we do to let them back in? So there's this whole conversation around, well, maybe we should baptize them again, because they've left the faith, they've recanted, and maybe the way we should let them in is to re-baptize them. Those folks lose that battle. But authority becomes a major issue at this point, and there's a lot of discussion about whether bishops are actually overstepping their authority. And a guy named Cyprian says no, that this is the bishop's job, that we can't just rely on the Spirit to do this for us. So that pushes us a little bit further towards this authoritarian movement. It also, remember that the rebaptism thing lost, and that sticks with us to this day. We never rebaptize people for any reason, even if they recant their faith or whatever. And that's very important to us to this very day. This is also the time when apostolic succession becomes talked about for the first time. Anybody know what apostolic succession refers to?
Yeah.
A bishop has to be ordained by 3 other bishops and so on.
Right.
Down the line.
Right. So the theory is that going back to Peter, there was this line of people that were ordained that had hands laid on them, and that has continued all the way to today. So churches that believe in apostolic succession trace their roots all the way back to Peter and say, well, we had hands laid on us all the way through. And that became very important because authority was a major issue in the church then. So this became an important point. Good.
Were there a succession of bishops, or were there multiple bishops during this time?
There were multiple bishops during this time. So by the 200s, there are bishops of every region. Yep, yep.